This is Duke University.
One of the reasons why we organized this symposium to try to integrate Romani studies into various other fields, because I have a feeling as well that we are so much ghettoized in an academia, and it's very important to integrate Romani studies or Roma-related researches into a mainstream academic disciplines. So one of the issues what I would like to mention actually that we still needs to fully engage with reflection on what is our research is as a whole, and what do we achieve with that, and what contributes towards. And why I'm saying that, because sometimes if you are sitting in various circles, we're just hearing the same thing which has been recycled for many years. And I think it's very important to understand that what are the wider pictures, and what contributes towards our researches. And actually, one of the reasons why we brought the neoliberalism, because that was one of the big framework or governmental structure which needs to be problematized and analyze the nexus between Romani studies or Roma issue or Roma problems, as it is phrased in Europe, and how does it relate to the neoliberal governance. And I think that was very much already analyzed by Huub as well, and the edited books which was published by Nidhi, Trehan, and Nando Sigona. And maybe for those who are not so familiar with the Romani issues or the Romani studies, it's very important to mention that there is this very classical division between various scholars. There is a debate between that whether should we see the Roma as one large group with a specific linguistic and historical connections, or whether poverty or cultural differences make the notion of group as Roma, right? So the group making is very important. And there are two kinds of tropes of research. One is that which focus on redistribution, and I think Szalai is one of the hero or #1 researcher in that, who really talking about the situation of Roma as a structural inequalities. So, and group identities basically result from their basic lack of economic opportunities and resources, and lack of resources what the group as Roma has. And the other group of scholars are very much talking about the recognition paradigm, the recognition of the Roma rights, which state that racism and general lack of appreciation of the diversity of Roma groups, their histories and experiences, should be recognized in the historical and sociological canon in Europe. And actually, one of the interesting point which needs to be mentioned, that even Angus Fraser, who is a very famous historian, and he was the one who first wrote the book on gypsies, the history of gypsy, and he phrased it that Roma minorities should be seen as a minorities who are totally trapped in a poverty, and they are very much need to have some kinds of access to various wealth and resources in the society, or should we see them as a stigmatized group that needs to be recognized and valued? Why I'm talking about it, that is a very important point. So if we would actually analyze it from a sociological point of view. So this is kind of historical debate, right? So there is one group here and the other one is here. And I think the feminist theories are the one who try to both to bring together these two sides, and that's why I think intersectionality, which was mentioned by Carol, where are you, Carol Silverman, and my work and many others, Julia as well, that we try to bring together class, gender, ethnicity, how does it intersect, and what is the dynamic of that. So basically, what I would like to raise concerning the Julia's paper, which was about segregation as a multifaceted process of Roma marginalization, that that one of the issues which has been raised very recently by young scholars, particularly Hungarian sociological studies related to Roma, is actually overloaded by empirical stuff. It's so rich by numbers, right? All kinds of charts, which is really good, but we are very much missing the theories. So there is really a lack of theoretical discussions. And one of the issues, what I would like to raise concerning the Julia's paper, that I remember, and even today as well, when policymakers, even some of the researchers, when they are talking about segregation, territorial segregation, they refer to that as a spontaneous segregation. So it become like as a taken by granted without questioning. And I would like to interrogate a little bit that what is the theoretical background of that? And that's very much related to the issue which has been raised at the very beginning, that we really need to see the larger picture, right? So how segregation has been developed, what are the stages of that? And how can we explain? And this is very important because in these days, actually, there is a very, very strong reemergence of discourse on poverty culture. So Roma is seen like as a group of people who trapped in a poverty, and basically they socializing their children in such a way is their culture, and occluding the structural factors. So what are the structural factors behind that, what we have to intersect and interrogate? So that's one of the things what I think it would be very interesting to discuss it. And I wrote plenty of notes in the early morning, 2 o'clock. So, and I think that, yeah, just one little point in the brackets that basically for persistent idea have become a foundation of desegregation policies. Yes, that's what I wanted to talk about it, because basically desegregation policies, it was a kind of traveling ideas, traveling policies from the US, which has been implemented or tried to be implemented in the last 10 years. And there were 4 persistent ideas, which are the foundations of that. So the one is that the portrayal of ghettos as a pathological social forms, which is very much coming from US scholars, Julius Wilson, Massey, Danton. And the second one is the link poverty, concentration, and social problem with the neighborhood effect. You remember these kinds of explanations that people who are living in a ghetto and they have a certain behavior patterns because they are influenced by their neighborhood, and that needs to be eliminated or improved, or people needs to be desegregated in order to change that kind of behavior pattern. And the third point was that it's a kind of implicit suggestion that geographies, it's a kind of geographies of opportunities, which means that if you are following your opportunities, right? So you have to get out from your ghettos. You have to get out from your neighborhood. If you want to find a better job, if you want to have a better school, particularly in the US, right? Now I'm just thinking about my son, who's ended up in a public school, and we thought that US is much more developed and improved and desegregated, and he's ended up in a Spies Elementary School, which is very close to Wake Forest, and a kind of upper middle class neighborhood. But basically, he was the only white guy who considered to be a white guy in his classroom. So anyway, so why I told that, because if you are following this paradigm that the geography of opportunities, right? You have to move, you have to migrate, you have to do something in order to get better opportunities. And the fourth one is the assumption that the socially mixed environment would create some kind of leverage, right? Some kind of positive social network, social capital, referring to Putman, and they would have some kind of role model. So it's very important. In fact, we have a lot of sociological research which prove that Romani kids who has been in an integrated school setting, they have a much better educational achievement than those who trapped in a segregated schools because of the school environment, the network, the social capital, which is which is there and actually brought by the white middle class parents, right? And so I think that would be really interesting to problematize this whole segregation thing. So theorize. Okay, so I'm going to be very, very short. Yes. I'll stop it as well. So just the last point. And of course, you are invited, all of you, to talk about it. Okay, so just one more thing. So Huub was talking about this whole de-ethnicizing and right, the research which is very Eurocentric and Roma-centric, and the notion of internalized outsider, the Roma actually, who are like as a even we could call it as an internal colonies in Europe, which has been created territorially as well. And one of the issues, what I would be really interested to hear, and you didn't write about in your paper, you are talking about borders on page 8, right? I'm just reading. I have introduced the notion of Europeanization of Roma representation relates to the pressing issues discussed above and to enabling debate about the fundamental shifts and ambiguities regarding the contemporary position of Europe's Roma and regarding the ways in which Europe has bordered. I don't want to talk about the real physical borders. Rather, I would be more interested in this kinds of epistemic border, because I guess that's what we can understood under that as well, right? How do you conceptualize it, and what is your thoughts on that? And I just would like to bring one Fanon quote, Frantz Fanon, since we were talking about him, from the Black Skin and White Mask, when he was talking about, oh, my body make me always a man who questions. And I think this kind of basic categories of border epistemology or border thinking, the biographical sense of black body, the biographical sense of Romani bodies, right? The body politics. And what we just did, and which is uncovering politics of knowledge that is ingrained in the body and local histories. And that's my point, because what I'm really missing, this kind of historical link between the Europeanization. I think we just cannot say that there is a shift after 1989, but what are the local histories which can promote or goes against that kinds of Europeanization?
Okay.
I mean, here.
Most of us were asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning, and now I do see. I would make this suggestion to everybody. We have about 35 minutes. So if people would like to make comments or ask questions. We'll take them all together and then we'll bring them to the panel at the end. So if people have questions or comments, if they'd be kind enough to introduce themselves, because not everybody knows everybody, and we'll just jot them down, and then we'll give the panel, I dare not say this, 5 minutes each or something at the end, we'll see, depending how many comments there are. So is anybody burning with a comment or a question they'd like to? Yes, the gentleman at the back. Could you introduce yourself again, sir, would you mind?
My name's Solomon Burnett. Hello?
Yeah, you're on.
Thank y'all for being so indulgent. I'm a little more into romance studies than Roma studies. Broken heart is proof. I guess just elucidating discursive threads from the first talk to now, looking at Fanon's definition in Towards an African Revolution of political power is the ability to control violence. The African-American trend of integration being associated with military service. And I was going to ask, are any of y'all using as a bar to measure either acquisition of political power, securitization, or integration, Romani recruitment or enlistment into different militaries? And of course, there are problematic masculinist and patriarchal issues associated with psychosocial formation with this, but you know, it's a measurable standard, and I was wondering how that was playing into your research.
Okay, let's leave that on the table then and see if there are other questions as well. David.
We historians and legal types are sort of meat and potatoes people, so we don't speak a lot of the sociological and anthropological language you do, so some of it goes over our heads. I guess my question is, sometimes we get into such theoretical stuff, we seem to lose the face of the people we're talking about, which troubles me quite a bit. Another problem I have is the whole idea of Europeanization. I spend probably about a month a year in Europe, last summer Poland, this summer Romania. And I travel all over and have sort of, not chuckled, but really stood back and really, is there really going to be a united Europe like they want? I mean, you've got the European Union, the Council of Europe, and all this and that. And of course, a great flow of funding for Roma programs coming from Brussels and Oslo and things like that, Budapest, New York. And watching all of this happening, it seems to me that we're still really talking about issues on a very, very local level. That the reality is now Romanians are saying they're tired of being assumed that they're automatically, by being Romanian in England, that they're tired of being assumed that they're also, by being from Romania, they're also Roma and things like that. I think that going back to the African American thing, it took a very, very, very long period of time for there to be in this country great public awareness of the plight of African Americans. And we're still struggling with a lot of those issues. And this is 120 years after 750,000 American males were butchered in a civil war partially fought over that issue. The point I'm trying to make here is slow down. In other words, I don't disagree with anything that all of you projected, but what I am saying to you as someone who stood and watched this process in Europe, who on a longer basis knows historically that a similar problem in the United States, remember we've had a lot of problems, not with African Americans, now we have problems with Hispanic prejudice, the Chinese in the 19th century, I mean, you name it, we've been through it. But I don't really think that Europe in general, I'm not sure that Europeanization really works in the case of, say, Romania, because what you're dealing with is very, very local issues. And I think there has to be an evolution of this process. I think it will come at time, presuming the European Union stays together, you know, the Greeks and all this and that. But what I'm saying is that I think that the body of scholarship, the body of study, still needs to focus on the human face of the individual Roman problems, because in reality, what, for example, The Norwegian, if you look at the recent report by the Norwegian Fund about the issues dealing with, say, the questions in Romania, if you look at the World Bank report and so on and so forth, they admit that some mistakes were made in the first decade of Roma inclusion, and now the focus is more on local issues and local leadership and things like that, and activating Roma activists and things like that. This is something that I don't know is necessarily European. I think it's a very, very localized Romanian issue. I can't address Bulgaria or Hungary. We have a lot of Hungarians here, so you have a better idea of what's happening there. But while it's good to project out, we also don't want to lose the human face of the individualized problems at the very, very local levels, because they're, in some cases, very, very serious.
Let's take those two then, before we take a third. A reaction to the militarization, and then we'll go Carol in a minute. Any to the question of the measuring part? Plenty more. Yes. Oh. Any people want to come in on these? Carol, do you want to come in then?
Oh, nice. Yeah, okay. So this is for Huub. I agree with you in most of your points, but I think I would like to ask you to elaborate more on what actually it would look like, some of your proposals, if you follow them through. So for example, the de-ethnicization of Romani, of the field. Okay, so that might lead you to, again, the Seleni Ladani school. So then you're in economic structuralism. You might end up there, which I don't think you want to be there, but it might lead you there. Okay, and I don't want to be there either. But also, if you look at middle-class Roma, they face discrimination in some of the same ways as lower-class Roma. So there is a cultural component, I would say, that you don't want to lose, because basically Roma have been constructed historically as a very specific type of cultural other in Europe. So how can you bridge this kind of gap in a way that makes sense? Whereas obviously, if you're looking at lower class Roma, you do want to look at structural economic placement. But obviously, if you're looking at discrimination in general, you can't only look at structural economic placement. So how would you feather this out?
There were two questions right down the side. Yes. Well, no, let's put them all together.
Thank you. A couple of points, but maybe I can cut back if, yeah. Time is, time. Very quickly, I think we are intellectualized with Julia in many projects she mentioned, but I would be cautious to discard the notion that that's not what she did, right? But just was very critical with desegregation, but more of warning all of us that I think, in my understanding, desegregation has come as a political, as a policy, if you wish, even a sociological or movement term, as working against or doing away with social exclusion. So if we don't like the term and we don't think that, social exclusion, which includes political, spatial, cultural, all kinds of exclusion, and one manifestation is desegregation or segregation, then desegregation is clearly a concept which is pretty much influenced by the notion of social exclusion and the multifaceted nature of social exclusion. And I think for many critical thinkers, desegregation includes political participation. So I think it's worth emphasizing that desegregation in itself it's a relatively simple term that's spatially moving people from one location to another, but I think the term is much, much more complicated, or it's used in a multiple ways. So I would be more cautious to see desegregation and politics as different or additional terms. To Huub, I think you are speaking from my mind and heart. I mean, as one of the recent events, we talked together on migration and Roma issues. So I would just put the notion or the caveat to use the neoliberalization. I know you use it in a much more delicate way, but neoliberal transformations as a cover term to explaining, several, processes that you very nicely started to spell out that kinds of regimes of policy and political production. I would just raise the point that Europeanization, I think, is, I would not fully put your intellectual agenda, shift the Europeanization of the Roma policies or the Roma or Roma politics to a Europeanization of the representation of the Roma, as we know that many of those regimes that you mentioned, I think partly produced through Europe. So it's partly global capitalism, it's partly, you know, various non-European or not exclusively European issues, but Europe is reconstituting or rearranging many of these regimes. So I would not, you know, push it just to a representation or yes, European representation of the Roma issue. Okay.
Oh, one more.
Thank you. I'm Martin Revit, coming from Hungary. I work for the Decade of Roma Inclusion, but now I don't represent the organization. I will speak on my own name. And I think what I found very interesting as a common underlying theme, which is not only in this workshop, but in general when we discuss Roma inclusion, is the feeling of failure and unsuccessful projects. And it came out in different forms in all these discussions. And when we look from Europe or from Eastern Europe to the US, we always have the feeling of successful, let's say, emancipation. So I would throw in this concept into the discussion, how much African-American emancipation was successful, and also looking back, Jewish and women emancipation. So the big question is, how do we end up, why is it unsuccessful, or what are the failures of Romani emancipation? And part of the story is, I think, it's not happening in one country. So it is not as straightforward as, let's say, African-American emancipation in the US or the women's movement. But on the other hand, I think what many of us are talking about, including Huub as well, whether this Europeanization and additional layer is helpful or actually counterproductive. So this is what I feel, that many of these efforts aiming to help Roma from outside in different forms, it can be counterproductive. And there are different understandings what we mean by inclusion. Now we have this developmentalist approach that to decrease the social gap between Roma and non-Roma. But it's very interesting to see that you mentioned that integration means involvement into the military service. So actually for the Roma we don't have this. But traditionally in Hungary, the involvement of Jewish population in the military service was conducive to their emancipation in the 19th century, when they joined the freedom fight against the Habsburg monarchy. So I think that was an important step. But let me just finish with a more provocative question. So if these international and European programs can be counterproductive and actually undermine the emancipation coming from below, from the Roma community, can we say that the most recent initiative of the European Roma Institute is another instance that could undermine the emancipation?
Why not respond to some of this, the panel?
So I'll start with the first question by Salman. Actually, I'm not really an expert on Roma participation in military, but what I know is that there have been some books published recently means like 5 years ago, 6, 7 years ago perhaps. There was one on Russian Roma, very interesting, about military service during the communist time. And the Romani heroes, war heroes during the communist regime, when it was USSR, when it was the Soviet Union. So from the different parts of the Russian Empire, the various Roma war heroes that had served, their photo, their biography. This book was in Russian, and about 6 years ago, it was supposed to be translated into English. They didn't get enough funding. I have to find out. Thomas Acton knows about this book. Anyway, so it's there. I mean, people know that Roma have served in the military, and this was celebrated war heroes. But your other question about, perhaps, forcible, encryption or enlistment into the services, or the sort of negative side of that, I would say that, maybe somebody here who knows about that more, because I really don't know. Okay. Oh, yes. That's actually an interesting, what I would call a neoliberal initiative. And, but, wrapped up in multiculturalism also, the idea being that if you're from the same background, you can work in your own community better and you can be a better interlocutor between the majority and the minority, that whole thing. And that initiative is there. I know in Czech Republic, there's some recruitment for Roma to join the police services. And also probably in Hungary. And I think this is throughout Europe now. I don't know how successful it's been, or if it's been seen as an avenue of social mobility amongst the young men who get recruited. Yes, it is. So maybe Angéla wants to. No.
One just tiny thing, that there is now sorry, Romani police officers association in the UK, and it apparently has a bunch of
in the Czech Republic and in Macedonia.
Right. So so it is a thing. I only know one. I know one Czech Romani policeman who's in the United Kingdom. It's an interesting kind of project. It's an interesting dynamic. He will say at certain points that there's a lot of Roma who hate him because, but your original question about the military, I have some thoughts on that. I mean, just from the Czech perspective or Czechoslovak, there's also that history in the wartime of Romani partisans, in the resistance movement, which, so right, and it's interesting that I don't think I mean, it's been completely erased, right? Like, you really have to dig in history to get at that. So that's one thing. The other thing is there was mandatory military service in many of these countries that we're talking about up until very recently. And in the Czech Republic, I mean, I can't really, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an anthropologist of this, but just from experience of talking to people, there's kind of a narrative, that this did help integrate the Roma. It helped them, just like any other kind of putting people together, helps them integrate. There's no narrative about what it might have done for the majority population, which I think is interesting. Like, did they actually, learn anything from being together like this? But one thing it made me think of, which is a larger issue, is that I think there is a decent subset of Roma who are middle class or middle class aspiring, as I call them, who also have that narrative of this was a really important thing because they were in the army, together with the Gaje, with the non-Roma, and it really helped them kind of just, for lack of a better word, integrate. And I'd like to pose a question to the actual sociologists and anthropologists in the room, which is, how much research do we do with Roma who are economically successful, however you want to define that, not in the underclass, working, employed, business owners, that kind of thing. Not activists, not academics, and not musicians.
Hungarian books I had some.
Okay. So how much, I mean, because I haven't really come across it in terms of talking to these Roma and saying things like, how do you feel about military service? What do you think about integration? And what do you think about what's wrong with like everything else that's going on? Because what I get from talking to, this general category of people is some really interesting opinions that sometimes agree with what I think, sometimes differ. And almost always, I would have to say, add a lot to this conversation or, disagree with a lot of what we kind of say as academics and activists. And I just kind of got this flash of inspiration. I would certainly love to read everything that's on that, and I would love to see it expanded. I mean, if there's something happening in Hungary, I don't know of these projects happening elsewhere. So sorry, that was kind of a lot, but.
I think your point is really well taken, Petra, that I think a lot of times we aren't doing research with, middle class and educated communities who have, much to add to this. I remember when I was doing my field research, there was this woman entrepreneur, a baker, in Czech Republic, and she told me her story. She started off selling baked goods at the railway station. Then she earned enough money. Then she got 2 ovens in her house, and she wasn't connected to any of these networks, you know. This was well before a decade of Roma inclusion, and I was thinking to myself, wouldn't it be wonderful to get more of these types of stories and biographies of these people who have made it and who've made it on their own, pretty much. They've seen an opportunity, and they've gone out there and they've done something, and they're not connected to any political party or, you know, Roy or whatever. It's just like all, you know, they're just living their life, and they've done something against the odds, and, you know, they've so then this woman, she ended up employing, I think, 50 people. So eventually she had her own bakery, and she became an employer herself. And so she, not only that, she contributed. And there's a lot of stories like that which are not written up about. A lot of stories like that. Yeah.
Also in terms of, you know, not just the success itself, but in terms of the ideology.
Yes.
Like, these are very different ideologies.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely, I agree.
we just take Julia and then Huub.
So, shall I
Hey,
continue?
Julia first,
Your-
and then-
Julia, what do you want to say?
You raised very important issues, and I would like to react to the point that Angéla made, and briefly to what Viola made. As to the theoretical backing, it's not enough time. Just I would like to point out that what I would emphasize is that you have to reconsider studies on class and studies on social stratification and studies on power as the frameworks providing understanding for segregation. So I think that taking it as a minority issue or even a poverty issue contains some, you know, paradoxes and might be a trap. So it might get to itself, the study on segregation itself, which is quite often the case as we look at studies currently, otherwise being very important and being quite influential on issues of segregation, either in Romania or in Hungary or elsewhere. So the large questions are quite rarely raised, I think, so I fully agree with you. But I was expecting you to say that introduction. Obviously, I wouldn't speak against desegregation, but let us see that the term segregation and also desegregation has went through certain inflation. So that's true that it had a rich and still has a rich content in the hands of OSI people and DK people. At the same time, the term has been picked up, for example, by the current Hungarian government, and the usage of it is very different. So if there was a hidden agenda in what I said, that in a country where currently segregation becomes legitimized by the government, not only allowed, but still legitimized, then you have to find a way around to do something against segregation. Thank you.
Yes, well, there are many different things I would like to address or to respond to. Maybe let me start by connecting to the previous panel, and I think one of the most important difficulties we face is, I think, to really get recognized and addressed issues of race and discrimination publicly, which then connects to, you know, how do we actually achieve at how do we reach the moment where we can publicly debate the issues we would like to discuss. And therefore, I think it's necessary to de-ethnicize, as I called it, the debate. But let me return to that issue later. Two stories, two different issues with regard to the important point brought up by Marton about failure and success. I think a relatively recent, wonderful study called Stuck in Place, written by Patrick Sharkey, 2012, 2013, about this position of African Americans in the US, is suggesting, okay, well, the African Americans have achieved more equality, but there's no less desegregation, there's more poverty, which I think has been wonderfully addressed by Obama in his Martin Luther King speech 2 years ago or so, or last year. So it's not a success story. I mean, there are a lot of things still to be addressed, and there's a lot of poverty. That's one story, and the other story is the famous analysis of Hannah Arendt of the position of the French Jews, largely integrated and assimilated in French society. And she said, well, then they started to develop new mechanisms of anti-Semitism. So we always need to be careful for, inclusion will definitely not be the solution to dealing with issues of race and anti-Gypsyism or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. So that's a kind of introduction to the issue of Europeanization that some of you, and the issue of bordering that relates to what I do in my paper. I think Europeanization for me is not a kind of a large overarching umbrella term for what's going on. For me, it's very much related to what I see at the local level. It's very influential, I would say, at the local level, because if a municipality at the border of the Czech Republic and Poland is introducing with European funds a regeneration, a gentrification or development of a neighborhood where many Roma live by repaving the central square. Now, these are the things that are going on. So that's done in the name of the European funds dedicated to Roma and their inclusion. And at the very same place, to come to the issue of the police, which is, I think, directly connected. I'm doing a lot of research on police involvement, also Roma who are employed by the police in different countries, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, the UK. I was at a meeting organized, what's in the name, within the building of New Scotland Yard in London in December, organized with the money of the Council of Europe about the position of Roma in the police force. In this very special municipality, the director of a private security company became the director of the police, and then he was elected the mayor, and using, of course, all his resources to introduce a zero-tolerance policy with regard to the Roma, including Roma working for the local police offices. So what is their scope? What can they do, even if with the help of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, municipalities are introducing relatively progressive community policing projects, and they land in an environment which is really Roma hostile. There are not so many parameters to change the local situation. So what do I mean then by de-ethnicizing the issue? Is also to focus on the more structural, if you may want, of course, the structural economic things, but not in the style of Ladany and Zeleny, although I think there's much good stuff in their work as well, so don't throw away all of the work they did. I think there's a really valuable work in their work. But also to look at the kind of larger dimensions of what's going on. You know, I mentioned this local police situation. I mentioned the way in which European funds have been mobilized or abused. It is, I think, directly related to the issue of bordering and Europeanization that I try to address in my work. Why and how? Well, if you look at, for instance, how Europol is financing transnational police collaboration, and they have established, for instance, task force on itinerant criminal groups, you see that these task force on itinerant criminal groups are in daily practice in how these transnational police collaborations operate, are targeting Roma very often, whether in France, in the banlieue, or in Czech ghetto-like situations, or in the United States. And a wonderful study by Didier Fassin on urban policing is particularly dedicated to this topic. What is happening in the French banlieue with regard to Romani migrants, with regard to migrants with a longer history in France. So why is it related to bordering? Because in these practices, there are, of course, these cultural practices that you know, the Roma are very often stopped and searched, whereas in actual fact, very often there is no criminal offense against them, in the majority of cases. So there is the cultural bias. So there is the bordering, I would say. The bordering is happening. And it's maybe a long way to explain how exactly, I have tried to do that into a few of my recent papers, how that connects to the transnationalized policing and the new fashions, very often with progressive discourses, introduced transnational police collaborations. But you see that this is really spreading all over Europe. And to mention just the final example in this case, there is also a connection with the notorious headscarf debates. You know, as soon as a woman is wearing a headscarf, that's a sign of oppression. You know, that's the kind of stereotypical way in which it has been interpreted. What we see now is that a lot of European money is going to police groupings that are focusing on the violation of the rights of Romani women and children, because they need to be safeguarded. They need to be rescued from the Roma men and the bad influences of Romani culture. So in general, there's nothing wrong with targeting, of course, domestic violence and what have we. I mean, all these things are, of course, very crucial and important to address. But when it comes to the mixture of this kind of progressive discourse on the violation of rights and the ways in which it is overlapping with really regressive daily practices of police officers, or not necessarily police officers, I think it's very, very scary development going on. And I see that in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Germany, it's really growing business. And they collaborate with the Czech police, with the Slovak police, with the Hungarian police. So the Dutch police is training the Czechs how to deal with these issues with European money. So, you know, I don't want to focus much more on this police issue, but I think it's a very interesting development, also in terms of how.
I think we're going to run out of time.
Yeah.
Can I sorry, just something I want to clarify. This is really important about policing, about the, you know, how it's being sort of distorted. This, the example you gave, you said that the OSCE actually funded this new Scotland Yard meeting that they had on community policing. And that at
Council,
this meeting,
Council of Europe and Romani Studies Academic Network funded program organized by Margaret Greenfield.
Okay. No, but you said that there was the president of this is a former private security guard company owner.
That's another story, yeah.
And who is hostile towards Roma.
Yeah.
And this was funded by.
No. This is
okay.
This is nationally funded.
Well, guys,
right. Yeah. There's a. Okay.
The beauty of a 2-day symposium like this is there is a second day, and we are about to be expelled. I think from this cold room into the warmth of North Carolina, which is probably a good idea. But I, on everybody's behalf, thank our panelists for a wonderful session.